You have been misled, you have been deceived, and now we are going to tell you the truth of what really happened. The religious innovations made by the Romans in this time of war with the Jews still affect us to this day, 2,000 years later. Indeed, many of the warring factions in today's world came from the fracturing of that initial monotheistic religion that occurred first in the era of ancient Rome during the era of the Flavian dynasty.
Historians and scientists have to first put aside their own biases, they have to be aware of their own beliefs and how they may motivate the direction of their investigations. But to be an objective historian, to be an objective scientist, all of the evidence from every discipline has to be coordinated into a unified understanding that actually explains where Christianity came from. How would a historian, for example, if they had no religious biases one way or another, approach this evidence? It requires approaching this evidence as they would any other subject. And that's precisely what we do in Creating Christ.
If we were starting with no religious bias whatsoever and considering the evidence as it is and as it has been passed down to us, all by itself for the first time, where would that evidence lead us? The astonishing coincidence that James discovered and brought to me was alarming to me as well. And what he had discovered was that in Josephus's history of the Jewish war, his description of the final siege of the temple in Jerusalem almost identically mirrored the description Jesus gives in the Gospels of the forthcoming destruction of the temple.
A prophecy, an apocalyptic prophecy about the end of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple that is ascribed to Jesus as a prophecy some 40 years before the event. Most scholars have come to the point that they realize that that description is so accurate, including a description of armies fighting in the clouds, that the Gospels themselves, which contain that prophecy of Jesus, could only have been written after the event, in retrospect to those events, being such an uncannily accurate description of what actually happened. Based on language and clues such as those from the Jesus' prophecy about the destruction of Jerusalem, scholars have located almost a consensus now that the Gospels were written sometime after the Jewish War, but not too far after the Jewish War. So placing it during the Flavian era places the composition of the Gospels at precisely the same time that the Jewish historian, who was then working for the Roman Emperor Vespasian, were written at the same time. Jewish literature is famously monotheistic. By the time, whatever the history of the origins of Jewish monotheism, millennia earlier, by the time we have Hebrew scriptures in their current form, they're fiercely monotheistic, fiercely sectarian. It is the literature of the history of God's chosen people, the Jews. And in the course of this literature, a prophecy had developed that was in effect fulfilled over and over of Jewish people either being conquered by foreigners and having to retain their cultural identity within something like the Persian Empire or the Babylonian Empire, and that only got them to culturally dig in their heels even further and resist alien influence, Greco-Roman influence, as time went on, making all the more paradoxical this unity in Christian literature. But in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, as well as the 1st and 2nd centuries BC of the Common Era, what we have is a militant, nationalist, Torah orthodox Judaism, which is more and more requiring Jews to think that they need political independence to properly be Jewish, to properly execute the law of Moses, which they regard as sacred. And so the Torah itself became an object of political importance. Strict adherence to the Torah would make integration with the Greco-Roman world all the more difficult. And the most electric and the most politically charged concept within Jewish philosophy was the concept of Messiah. And so both pagan and Jewish historians of the era tell us point blank that the primary cause of the Jewish revolt in the first century were these messianic prophecies, were the prophecies contained in ancient Hebrew scripture of a real political, earthly deliverer who would lead the Jews to political independence. You know, one of the remarkable things as we were reading through the ancient history and looking at the ancient history is that the Jewish rebellion itself was said to have begun at around the year 7 AD, at the time of the first Roman census, of course, a preparation for the Romans to impose taxes on the region. That is when Josephus tells us that the Jewish rebellion started, that the rebellion of one Judas the Galilean started at that time. And fascinatingly, that is precisely when the Gospel of Luke in the New Testament places the birth of Jesus, as if Jesus' birth is metaphorically placed at the start of the Jewish rebellion.
And one of the things that didn't help matters was that Caligula himself wanted to set up a statue of himself right outside the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, something that created such havoc that he had to scuttle the project before there was a revolt right then and there.
Of course, quite famously, in fact, the objection that we run across most frequently to the theory of Roman providence is one that comes from Christian tradition of being persecuted and martyred at the hands of Romans, of Christians unwilling to integrate into Roman culture. This is largely a myth, but it is a myth that's understandable when you realize that there was an entirely different form of Christianity going on in the first century, a form of messianic Jewish nationalism, which, as a form of messianic Judaism, was easily confused by the Romans with Christianity itself. And sometimes we'll find in Roman historians a confusion between both the rebel philosophy, the ideology that motivated the militant, nationalist, Torah Orthodox rebels of the first century, calling them Christians, if you will, as well as our New Testament Christians, advocates of peace and paying your taxes and assimilating with Rome. And so there were what we might call Jewish Christians in the first century, people expecting the Messiah's arrival in the first century. That was, as we say, the motivation for the Jewish war itself, this Messianic Judaism, this form of Christianity, if you will, that was militant. These Christians, these Jewish Christians, if you will, were persecuted in great numbers because they were rebels. And if you think about it, why would the Romans actually persecute peaceful Christians? Our New Testament Christians were willing to render unto Caesar, pay their taxes, turn the other cheek, and be blessed peacemakers.
And use the Flavians' own symbols for their own.
Today, we use the word Christian in a very sectarian sense. The sense of Christian that we use it in was unknown in the first 2 centuries, of course. And to Romans who don't make fine distinctions between different forms of Messianic Judaism, they were all Christians. And so if we read in the first couple of centuries this confusion on the part of Roman historians between the militant form and our New Testament form, it's natural. However, today, the idea of a Jewish Christianity is almost entirely unknown. We exclusively think of Christianity in terms of the peaceful New Testament Christians we read about in the Bible. Perhaps the most famous case of Christian persecution, and certainly the earliest one we can corroborate through pagan sources, is the story Tacitus, the 2nd century Roman historian, tells of the Great Fire of Rome in 64. It was a conflagration that occurred just 2 years before the outbreak of the war in Judea in 66. And Tacitus specifically tells us that it was Nero who probably set the fire to his own capital, fiddling, if you will, while, as the famous, or playing a lyre, if you will, famously as Rome, his own capital, burns to the ground. And in order to find a scapegoat, Tacitus tells us, he pinned it on this group called the Christians, a group Tacitus regards as a completely pernicious group, well-deserving of punishment. And we are told, of course, by Tacitus that these are the followers of Jesus. And this is one of the earliest references to Jesus by a pagan historian, one of the first references outside of the New Testament. And so Christians will often point to that as proof of first century persecution of Christians, which they assume, of course, are Pauline Christians, are pro-peace Christians, which would be an utterly perverse thing. Why would Nero pin the blame on a group of peace-loving Christians? Christians who follow Paul's dictates in Romans 13 to be peaceful, tax-paying, good slaves, obeying the Roman government as the agents of God on earth. It simply makes no sense to us. When, of course, when you look at the very era, Jewish Christians were militants who were, in fact, perhaps even the ones who set the fire. We know that Jewish militants in Antioch were responsible for arson at about this time, as well as other terrorist, what we would call today, terrorist activities throughout the Roman Empire. There were disturbances in Alexandria before the war. There were disturbances in Rome itself, which caused the Emperor Claudius, 16 years before the outbreak of the Jewish War, to expel all the Jews from the city of Rome because of disturbances led by one Chrestus. This suggests that both Suetonius and Tacitus are confusing the militant Jewish Christians with what we regard as Christians, Pauline, peaceful Christians. And this very confusion can help explain why this group would have been targeted as a scapegoat, or perhaps even point to them as more probable perpetrators of the fire. Most historians reach the point that they believe that Nero did not torch his own capital and burn it to the ground. It caused him nothing but political and financial troubles. Whereas the propaganda against Nero, even by Roman historians, became very negative and very critical of Nero. So they wouldn't believe anything he said anyway. But if you look at it from another angle, could, a mere 30 years after the crucifixion, could there have been enough of our Pauline Christians in Rome to have made a credible scapegoat? The Gospels had not even been written yet in 64. And so how many Romans would even be aware of New Testament Christians to be able to pin the blame on them as a credible source before the legendary missions of Peter and Paul to the city of Rome, before the Gospels had even been composed? Whereas, of course, in 66, just 2 years after the Great Fire of Rome, the rebellion would break out in Judea itself.